She tore her last sandwich in half on a cold, rainy night and handed it to a man she had never met in her life. No name, no explanation. Just 5 quiet words that stopped him cold. I can survive without it. That single moment on a crowded Boston City bus would crack open 2 broken lives, and nobody in that rain-soaked city had any idea what was coming next. If you're watching this from Chicago, Dallas, or right there in your living room, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if kindness like this still moves you, hit subscribe. You're going to want to stay for all 5 parts. The rain came down hard that Tuesday evening. Not the soft, quiet kind of rain that makes people slow down and think. This was the kind of rain that punched through old jackets and turned bus stop puddles into small rivers. The kind of rain that reminded a man exactly how thin the line was between holding it together and falling completely apart. Ethan Carter sat near the back of the number 47 bus with his shoulders pulled in and his jaw tight. He was 35 years old. He had the hands of a man 20 years older, cracked knuckles, calluses thick as leather, a scar along his right index finger from a job site accident 2 summers back. His jacket was waterproof once back when he bought it at a garage sale 4 years ago. Now it just kept the wind out mostly. He wasn't thinking about the rain. He was doing math. Quiet, desperate, invisible math, the kind that working fathers do in their heads when no one is watching. Paycheck comes Friday. Today is Tuesday. 3 days. Lily needs breakfast tomorrow. She's almost out of peanut butter. The school asked again about the activity fee, $22. The landlord left another note this morning under the door. He exhaled slowly through his nose and stared at the wet blur of streetlights through the bus window. 3 years. 3 years since the hospital called him at 6 a.m. on a March morning and told him that Sarah wasn't going to make it. An infection that moved fast. Too fast. She was 32 years old, and she had been fine just 6 days before. They had argued that week about something so stupid he couldn't even remember what it was. That was the thing that still got him late at night when Lily was asleep and the apartment was quiet. Not the grief. The argument he couldn't take back. He became a single father on a Tuesday morning 3 years ago. And every Tuesday since then felt like the universe reminding him. He shifted in his seat. The bus was crowded, wet coats, umbrellas dripping onto the floor, the smell of fast food from someone's takeout bag 2 rows ahead. Nobody made eye contact on city buses. That was the unspoken agreement. You were allowed to be invisible here. You were allowed to fall apart a little as long as you did it quietly. Ethan was doing exactly that. His stomach growled. He pressed his arm against it instinctively, an old habit now. He'd skipped lunch again. He told himself it was because he forgot, but that was a lie he'd stopped believing even as he told it. He hadn't eaten since the granola bar he'd split with Lily at breakfast, and he'd given her the bigger half, and she hadn't noticed, and that was exactly how he needed it. He pulled out his phone. One notification, a text from his sister Karen in Ohio. "How are you guys doing? Haven't heard from you in a while. Lily doing okay in school?" He stared at it for a long moment. Then he put the phone back in his pocket without answering. I didn't know how to explain it. Not in a text. Not to someone who lived in a house with 2 incomes and a yard and a dog named Biscuit. How do you say I'm disappearing, Karen? I go to work every day, and I come home every night, and I make sure Lily never sees it, but I am disappearing. How do you send that as a text message? You don't. So you just don't answer. She got on at the Elm Street stop. Ethan noticed her the way you notice anything on a bus when you've been staring at the middle distance for 20 minutes, not because he was looking, but because she was hard to miss. She was a big woman. Full-figured, solid, the kind of woman who took up space unapologetically, though something in her eyes suggested she'd spent a long time apologizing for it anyway. She was wearing a dark blue raincoat that had seen better decades, and she was carrying a backpack over one shoulder and a plastic umbrella that was completely inside out from the wind. She wrestled the umbrella closed without even flinching. Like this was just Tuesday. Like broken things were just part of the deal. She found a seat directly across the aisle from Ethan. He looked away. She dug into her backpack and pulled out a brown paper bag. From the bag she pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, the kind wrapped carefully, like someone who packed it that morning, knowing it was going to have to last. Molly Harper unwrapped it slowly. She was 38 years old, and she had worked 11 hours that day at a small bakery on Hanover Street on her feet the entire time. And this sandwich turkey on whole wheat with mustard made at 5 a.m., before her shift, was the only thing she had eaten since a cup of coffee at noon. It was supposed to be dinner. It was dinner. She took one bite. Then she stopped. She wasn't sure what made her look up. Maybe it was the sound, or the absence of sound, the way a person goes very, very still when they're trying not to be noticed. She looked across the aisle at the man in the worn-out jacket. He was staring at the floor. His jaw was clenched. His hands were folded together on his lap, gripping each other like they were the only solid things he had left. And there was something in the set of his shoulders, not defeat exactly. Something worse than defeat. Something that looked like a man who had been defeated so many times that he'd stopped expecting anything different. She recognized it, not because she was a social worker or a therapist, but because she had sat exactly like that 2 years ago in a hospital waiting room after a health scare, alone, afraid to call anyone because she didn't want to be a burden. She knew what that posture cost. She looked back at her sandwich. She looked back at him. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, because she knew herself, and she knew she would talk herself out of it, given half a chance, she did something. She broke the sandwich in half, cleaned down the middle, rewrapped his half in the wax paper, leaned across the aisle. "Hey." Ethan looked up, startled. The way people look when they've been so inside their own heads that the outside world becomes a surprise. "Take this," Molly said simply. He stared at the half sandwich in her outstretched hand. "I'm sorry. It's turkey. I didn't put anything weird in it. Well, mustard. But that's not weird." She paused. "You look hungry." Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't embarrassment exactly. It was something older and deeper than that. It was the face of a man who had been working very hard to make sure nobody saw what she had just seen. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you. Keep it. I already broke it. You should eat it." "I took a bite of my half. I'm good." He shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, I appreciate it, really. But I can't take your food." Molly lowered her hand for a moment, tilted her head, looked at him with an expression that was not pity, nothing even close to pity, but something steadier and more serious than that. "Can I tell you something?" she said. He blinked. "Okay. I know what it looks like when a person hasn't eaten," she said. "Not because I'm judging you, because I've been that person. And I know what it feels like when somebody offers you help and your pride tells you to say no." She paused. "Your pride isn't hungry, but you are." The bus lurched to a stop. A few people got off. Rain drummed against the windows. Ethan Carter looked at the half sandwich. He hadn't cried in 3 years. Not once. Not when he buried Sarah. Not when Lily asked him why Mommy wasn't coming home. Not on any of the 100 nights since then when he sat on the kitchen floor after Lily was asleep and stared at nothing. He had decided somewhere in the fog of those first terrible weeks that he was not allowed to fall apart. That falling apart was a luxury he couldn't afford. That Lily needed a father who was standing up. I was not going to cry on a city bus over a half sandwich offered by a stranger. He took it. "Thank you," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Don't mention it." He ate it in 4 bites. He didn't mean to eat it that fast. It just happened. The mustard was sharp and good, and the bread was real bread, not the thin sandwich bread from the discount rack he usually bought. And it was without question the best thing he had tasted in weeks. When he looked up, she was looking out the window. "I'm Ethan," he said. She turned back. "Molly." "Molly." He nodded once. "Thank you. For real." "You already said that." "I know. I meant it more the second time." The corner of her mouth pulled up. "I can survive without it," she said simply. He looked at her. Then really looked at her in the way you look at a person when you suddenly understand that they mean something. "That's either the most generous thing I've ever heard," he said, "or the saddest." She considered that for a moment. Maybe it's both, she said. His stop came 3 minutes later. He stood up, steadied himself on the overhead rail, and looked at her one last time. I hope tomorrow's a better day, he said. For you, I mean. She smiled, a real one. Same to you, Ethan. He stepped off into the rain. The doors closed, the bus pulled away, and Molly sat back and finished her half of the sandwich, watching the streetlights streak past the wet glass, and she thought about the look on his face when he took it. Not gratitude exactly. Something more fragile than that. Something that looked like a man who had forgotten for just a moment that he was alone. She hoped he remembered it tomorrow. She hoped it lasted at least that long. What Molly didn't know, sitting on that bus, finishing the last 4 bites of her dinner, was that the man she had just fed was going home to an 8-year-old girl who had saved half her after-school snack for him because she had noticed that her dad never seemed to eat when she wasn't looking. What Ethan didn't know, stepping off that bus into the cold Boston rain, pulling his thin jacket tighter, was that the woman who had just given him half of everything she had was 3 weeks behind on rent, had been turned down for 2 promotions she was fully qualified for, and had cried in a bathroom stall at work that very afternoon because a coworker had made a comment about her weight in front of the whole kitchen. 2 people, both carrying weight the other couldn't see, both surviving. One had offered what she had. The other had finally accepted what he needed. Neither one of them understood yet what they had just set in motion. That night, Ethan sat on the edge of Lily's bed after she fell asleep. She slept with one arm thrown over her head, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her mouth slightly open the way it had been since she was a baby. She looked exactly like her mother when she slept. She always had. It was the thing that broke him the most and held him together the most simultaneously every single night. He watched her breathe for a long time. Then he went to the kitchen. He opened the cabinet. Half a jar of peanut butter, 4 slices of bread, an apple, a box of oatmeal with maybe 3 servings left. He stood in front of that cabinet for a long time, doing the math again, the math that never ever came out even. But something was different tonight. He wasn't sure what it was exactly. Maybe it was the mustard. Maybe it was the way she'd said your pride isn't hungry, but you are so matter-of-factly, without a trace of condescension. Maybe it was the simple startling fact that a complete stranger on a bus, a woman who had just worked 11 hours on her feet and had 1 sandwich to her name, had looked at him and decided he mattered enough to share with. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him like that. He closed the cabinet. He sat down at the kitchen table. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Carter let himself think a thought he had been carefully, deliberately avoiding. Maybe I don't have to do this entirely alone. It was a small thought, barely a whisper. He didn't trust it yet. He'd built too many walls too carefully to tear them down over a sandwich. But it was there. And it was still there in the morning. And when Lily came padding out of her room at 6 a.m. in her dinosaur socks and her hair in 17 different directions and said, "Daddy, you look different today," he pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than usual. "Different how?" he asked into her hair. She pulled back and studied his face with the terrifying accuracy of an 8-year-old who had been watching her father very carefully for 3 years. "Like something good happened," she said. He thought about a woman on a bus and a broken sandwich and 5 words spoken without hesitation. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Something small." "Small things count," Lily said with complete conviction, and went to the refrigerator to get the orange juice. He stared after her. She had her mother's certainty, her mother's absolute unshakable confidence in things most people second-guessed. He had no idea how she'd kept it growing up the way she had. But she had. Small things count. He poured 2 glasses of orange juice and made the last of the oatmeal and sliced the apple in half between them, and they ate breakfast at the small kitchen table, while the morning news played quietly in the background. And Lily told him everything that was wrong with her teacher's new homework policy, and he listened and asked questions and disagreed in exactly the right places. And when she left for school, backpack bouncing, he stood in the doorway and watched her go and thought, "I have to be here. I have to keep going. Because she needs me to. He'd thought that before. But today, it felt like something other than just obligation. Today, it felt like something close to hope. He didn't expect to see Molly again. That was the thing about moments like that on city buses. They happened, and then they were over, and the city swallowed everyone back up into their own separate lives, and you didn't get sequels. He figured he would remember her the matter-of-fact way she'd broken that sandwich. The calm in her voice, the way you remember a song you heard once and never found again. A good thing that passed through and kept going. He was wrong about that, but he wouldn't find out how wrong for another 4 days. And those 4 days of carrying a small, unfamiliar thing that felt almost like hope, those days mattered too. Because sometimes the moment just before something changes is the most important moment of all. What would you have done on that bus? Drop your city in the comments, and if this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next? What Ethan discovers about Molly and what Molly discovers about herself, that's where this story really begins. 4 days. That was how long Ethan carried it. Not the sandwich that was gone in 4 bites on a rain-soaked Tuesday night. What he carried was something harder to name. Something that sat in the back of his chest like a coal that hadn't quite gone cold. He went to work. He came home. He made dinner. He helped Lily with her spelling words. He read her half a chapter of the book they'd been working through together, a story about a girl who discovers a secret door in her grandmother's house. And he kissed her goodnight and turned off her lamp and went and sat in the kitchen in the quiet. He did all of it the same way he always did. But something was different. He just couldn't put a name to it yet. On Wednesday, his foreman kept him 2 hours late on a site in Charlestown, a brownstone renovation that had hit unexpected problems in the foundation. The kind of problems that rewrote the whole day's plan and required everyone to stay until it was handled. Ethan didn't complain. He never complained. He put his head down and worked, and when it was over, he took the late bus home and paid Mrs. Delgado downstairs the $10 he owed her for watching Lily until 9, which left him with $43 to last until Friday. $43. He sat with that number at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed. Milk. Bread. The peanut butter was almost gone. Lily had mentioned twice casually the way she mentioned things she didn't want to make into a big deal that her friend Sophie brought fruit cups in her lunch every day. Not asking for them. Just noting it. The way an 8-year-old notes things when she is trying very hard not to want what she notices. He pulled out a piece of paper and wrote out what he needed and what it would cost, and then he did the math 3 different ways, hoping one version would come out better than the others. None of them did. He folded the paper in half and put it in the junk drawer, where he kept all the other pieces of paper he folded in half and didn't know what to do with. Then he thought about a woman who broke her last sandwich in half without blinking, and for some reason, that made the number feel slightly less like a wall and slightly more like a problem, which sounds like a small distinction. It wasn't. Thursday came and went. Friday came and his paycheck hit at midnight, and he transferred the rent portion immediately, because if he waited, he spent it. And then he took Lily to the grocery store before her Saturday morning soccer practice and let her pick one thing she wanted. Just one, and she stood in the cereal aisle for 4 full minutes with the seriousness of a general planning a campaign before selecting a box of Cinnamon Toast Crunch. "That's a good call," Ethan said. "I know," she said completely without arrogance, just fact. He laughed. Actually laughed. And it surprised him enough that he noticed it. Saturday afternoon, after soccer, after lunch, after Lily went to her friend Becca's house for a birthday party. Ethan had 3 hours to himself. This almost never happened. He usually filled it with the secondary grocery delivery job, logging on and taking runs to pad the account before Monday. But the app was slow that afternoon, and after 45 minutes of waiting for a ping, he gave up and went for a walk. No destination, just movement. Just the sensation of going somewhere that wasn't a job site or a grocery store or his own apartment. He ended up 6 blocks north of his usual radius in a neighborhood he passed through, but didn't usually stop in older buildings. A small park with a broken fountain, a community center with a hand-painted banner out front that said, "Family Resource Fair today, 1 to 4 p.m. He almost kept walking. But then he saw her. She was standing on the front steps of the community center, with a folding table propped against her hip, wrestling with the legs like they had personally offended her. She was wearing a yellow fleece that was too bright for the overcast afternoon, and her hair was pulled back, and she was having a full argument with the table under her breath, something that included the phrase, "absolute piece of garbage engineering." He stopped. "Molly." She looked up, blinked. Then something crossed her face. Recognition, surprise, and then something warmer than either. "Ethan." She looked at him, then back at the table, then back at him. "Fancy seeing you in my neighborhood." "I was just walking." "Okay. I didn't know this was your neighborhood." "I've lived 3 blocks that way for 4 years. She tilted her head. "You want to help me with this table before I throw it into traffic?" He crossed the sidewalk, took the other side of the table, and in 30 seconds, they had it unfolded and standing. She put her hands on her hips and looked at it like she was deciding whether to forgive it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it." He paused. "Let a beat pass. Though I feel like I've heard that somewhere." She looked at him. And then she smiled slow and real, and it changed her whole face in a way he hadn't seen on the bus in the dark on that rainy night. "Touché," she said. He helped her carry 2 more tables out, then some folding chairs, then 3 cardboard boxes full of pamphlets and supplies that the community center staff needed set up for the resource fair. He hadn't planned any of this. It just kept making sense to keep helping, and so he kept helping. By the time the tables were arranged, Molly was directing volunteers with the quiet efficiency of someone who had organized things like this many times before. Not bossy, just clear, the kind of person who knew exactly what needed to happen and communicated it in a way that made other people feel like they'd thought of it themselves. "You run these?" Ethan asked when there was a lull. "Volunteer," she said. "I just help set up usually, and sometimes I man the food table." He looked around. A dozen volunteers, most of them retirees or young people in college sweatshirts. Families beginning to file in. A sign on one table said, "Free groceries and household items, first come first served." "This place does a lot," he said. "It does everything," she said, and her voice shifted slightly. Something in it went careful and deliberate. "Hot meals on Wednesdays, after-school tutoring, the food pantry, job placement help. There are families in this neighborhood that would be underwater without it." He nodded slowly. She looked at him sideways. "You ever come to any of the programs?" He shook his head. "Why not?" "I manage," he said. The word came out faster than he meant it to. And she heard the speed of it because she was the kind of person who heard those things, and she didn't push. She just nodded once like she was filing it. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay. Not a judgment. Not a suggestion. Not the particular brand of loaded silence that some people use when they mean the opposite of what they're saying. Just okay." He stayed 3 more hours. I hadn't planned to. But a family came in with 3 young children, and the father looked exactly the way Ethan had felt on that bus on Tuesday night. That specific combination of exhausted and ashamed that you only recognize when you've worn it yourself. And Ethan went over and helped him carry a box of groceries to his car, and they talked for a few minutes about nothing important, the weather and the Red Sox and the roadwork on Commonwealth Ave, and when the man drove away, Ethan stood on the sidewalk and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Useful. Not useful in the way of carrying lumber or delivering groceries for an app. Useful in the way that mattered to somebody specific in that particular moment. He went back inside, and Molly handed him a paper cup of coffee without comment, and they stood near the food table while the afternoon wound down around them. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure." "That night on the bus." He stopped, tried to find the right way to say it. "Why did you do that? And I don't mean why did you give me the sandwich. I mean you didn't know me. You didn't know anything about me. I could have been anybody." She thought about it for a moment. Actually thought about it, which he appreciated, because the easy answer would have been some version of, "I just wanted to help," and left it at that. "I know what hunger looks like," she said finally. "Not just the physical kind, the other kind. When a person is so tired and so stretched and so alone in it that they've started folding in on themselves." She paused. I've been that person, more than once. You don't seem like someone who'd fold in on herself, he said. I seem a lot of ways that don't match what's actually happening. She said it without bitterness, just fact. People look at me and they see whatever they see. They don't usually see someone who's had a hard year. They see someone big and loud who takes up a lot of space and must be doing fine. She wrapped both hands around her paper cup. I was not doing fine on that bus. He looked at her. What was going on? She was quiet for a beat. I'd just found out I didn't get a promotion I'd been working toward for 18 months. Third time I applied for it. The owner hired someone from outside instead. Someone younger, smaller. She said the last word flatly. He didn't say that. He said it was about experience. But I've been baking for 12 years and the person he hired graduated 2 years ago, so. She shrugged. Not a resigned shrug, a deliberate one. It wasn't about experience. Molly, I'm not telling you so you feel sorry for me, she said quickly. I'm telling you because you asked why. And the why is, I was having a terrible night. And I looked across the aisle, and I saw someone having a terrible night. And it felt like the right thing to do to acknowledge that we were both just in it, together, even if just for a few minutes on a bus. Ethan was quiet for a moment. It helped, he said. More than I can really explain. She looked at him steadily. You going to tell me why? He took a breath. And then, and he still wasn't entirely sure why later, when he thought back on it, he did. He told her about Sarah. About March 3 years ago. About the argument he couldn't remember and couldn't forgive himself for. He told her about the math he did every night at the kitchen table, the folded pieces of paper in the junk drawer, the $43 that had to stretch until Friday. He told her about Lily, how she'd saved half her snack for him the other day, without saying anything. Just left it on the table next to his keys, with a little note that said for Daddy, and how that had almost broken him completely in the best possible way. He told her all of it in about 10 minutes, standing next to a folding table in a community center, while volunteers stacked chairs around them. And when he stopped talking, he felt like he'd just set down something that had been on his back for a very long time. Molly didn't say anything immediately. She looked at him. Then she said, Your daughter left food for you. Yeah. She's 8. Yeah. Molly pressed her lips together for a second, looked at the ceiling, then back at him. That kid, she said, is something else. He exhaled. She really is. You're doing something right, Ethan. He shook his head. Most days I feel like I'm just managing not to do everything wrong. That's more than most people manage. She said it simply like a fact, not comfort, not reassurance, just truth stated plainly. And it's enough. He didn't argue with her. That was new. He always argued when people tried to tell him he was doing enough, because the argument felt true. He wasn't doing enough. He couldn't be doing enough, would have been 2 parents and a stable income and a house with a yard where Lily could have a swing set. Enough wasn't what he had. But something in the way Molly said it made the argument feel small and exhausted in a way it hadn't before. So he just nodded. And they finished their coffee. And he helped her fold the last of the tables and load them back into the storage room, and when they stepped out onto the front steps, the afternoon had gone to early evening, the streetlights just starting to hum on. Same time next Saturday, she asked. He looked at her. You do this every Saturday. Most of them. He thought about Lily's soccer schedule. He thought about the delivery app. He thought about $43 and folded pieces of paper. Yeah, he said. Probably. She nodded, started down the steps. Molly. She turned back. That promotion, he said. Their loss. She smiled. Just with one corner of her mouth, a small controlled thing, like she was deciding how much of it she was allowed. You don't even know my baking, she said. I know you broke your last sandwich in half on a rainy Tuesday, he said. I think that tells me enough. She stood there for a second. Then she said, Get home safe, Ethan. And she walked away into the early evening, her yellow fleece bright against the gray of the sidewalk, and Ethan stood on the steps of the community center and realized he hadn't thought about the rent or the grocery math or the junk drawer full of folded papers for the last 3 hours. 3 hours. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened. He picked up Lily from the birthday party at 6:30. She came out of the house wearing a paper crown and carrying a slice of cake wrapped in a napkin, and she climbed into the passenger seat and immediately held out the cake. "This is for you," she said. "It's chocolate. I had mine inside." He looked at the cake. He looked at his daughter. "You can't keep doing this," he said. "Doing what?" She buckled her seatbelt with the focused seriousness she applied to all mechanical tasks. "Saving food for me. I'm the parent, Lily. I'm supposed to—" "It was a big piece," she said, completely matter-of-fact. "Too big for one person, and you like chocolate." He held the cake wrapped in the napkin, and he thought about Molly breaking a sandwich in half on a city bus and saying, "I can survive without it." And he thought about his daughter who was 8 years old, and somehow already understood the same truth without anyone teaching her. The math his daughter and this woman were doing wasn't like the math he did at the kitchen table. They weren't calculating what they could spare. They were just sharing, automatically, like it was the only equation that made sense. He ate the cake. "Good," Lily asked. "Really good." "I knew it," she said, and looked out the window satisfied. He started the car, and something in him, the part that had been calculating costs and holding walls up and keeping everything folded in half for 3 years, shifted. Just slightly. Like a door that had been stuck opening, not all the way, not yet, but enough to let a sliver of different air through. He didn't know yet what was on the other side of it. But for the first time in a very long time, he thought it might be something worth opening the door for. The next Saturday, he went back to the community center. And the one after that. And the one after that. He didn't plan it. He didn't make a decision about it. It just kept making sense to show up, and so he showed up. Lily started coming with him on the Saturdays. She didn't have soccer, and within 3 weeks, she had appointed herself the official organizer of the children's activity table, directing 4-year-olds through crayon drawings with the authority of someone 3 times her age. She gets that from her mother. Ethan told Molly one afternoon, watching Lily instruct a toddler on the correct way to color a sun. "She gets it from watching you," Molly said. He shook his head. "Ethan, you show up every week and you help without being asked, and you never make it about yourself." She paused. "She's watching that. That's what she's doing when she's watching you." He didn't answer, but he thought about that for a long time afterward. Meanwhile, Molly's week between Saturdays was not getting easier. She hadn't mentioned it to Ethan. She was careful about what she burdened people with, but the bakery had cut her hours, not fired her. Cut them. From 40 to 28, framed as a business adjustment delivered by the owner on a Tuesday morning, with the specific look of a man who had rehearsed the conversation and was relieved to be getting through it. She had smiled and said she understood, and gone back to the kitchen and finished her shift and cried in her car for 20 minutes afterward, and then gone to the grocery store and bought what she could and gone home. She picked up 2 shifts at a catering company she'd worked with occasionally. She called her cousin Diane in Providence to borrow $200 and hated herself for having to, and hated herself more for the way Diane paused before saying yes. She went through her expenses line by line and cut everything that wasn't essential and some things that were. She didn't tell Ethan any of it, but she noticed on the following Saturday that he had brought an extra container of food for the community center's hot meal program without being asked, and she wondered how much that cost him, and she said nothing, because she understood the particular dignity of giving something when you don't have much to give. You don't undercut it. You let it be what it is. What she didn't know was that Ethan had noticed her hours getting cut. He hadn't asked her directly, but 3 Saturdays back, she'd made an offhand comment about adjusting her schedule, and then the next week, she seemed quieter, more internal, the way people get when they are carrying something they've decided to carry alone. He recognized the posture. He'd worn it himself for 3 years. So on the 4th Saturday, he brought the food for the hot meal program. He didn't explain why. He just set it on the table. And she'd looked at him, and he'd looked back, and neither of them said anything, because neither of them needed to. This was the thing that was happening between them that neither of them had language for yet. It wasn't romance, though. Lily had asked him twice now in the car on the way home whether Molly was his girlfriend, with the bluntness of a child who had no interest in the social niceties adults use to avoid direct questions. It was something more foundational than that. It was the particular kind of understanding that develops between two people who have both learned to survive on very little and recognize in each other the specific kind of strength that looks from the outside, like simply getting through the day. They were both getting through the day, but they were starting to do it in the same direction. And then the Saturday came that changed everything. It was a wet, gray morning. October had come in hard, and the city felt like it was being pressed down by the sky, and Ethan arrived at the community center at the usual time to find Molly standing outside the front door, not setting up tables, not directing volunteers. Just standing there, alone, staring at a piece of paper in her hand. He knew before he even reached her that something was wrong. Molly. She looked up. Her expression did something complicated. She was composing herself actively. He could see it, and then she held out the paper. He took it. It was a notice. From the city. The community center's operating lease. The building they'd been in for 11 years was being transferred to a private developer. The city had not renewed the nonprofit lease. They had 90 days to vacate. He read it twice. "When did you get this?" he said. "It was in the center's mail this week. I only just found out this morning." Her voice was even. Too even. The director didn't want to tell the volunteers until she figured out what it meant. 90 days, he said. 90 days. He stood there for a moment. Can they fight it? Appeal the lease decision. They can try. They're small, Ethan. They operate on grants and donations, and whatever people bring in boxes on Saturday mornings. She folded the paper back up with precise, deliberate movements, like the folding was something she could control. There's no reserve fund. There's no legal team. There's barely a full-time director. I thought about the families he'd seen come through those doors every Saturday. The father with the 3 kids, who'd had that particular look. The elderly woman who came every week for the hot meal and stayed to play cards with the other regulars. The teenagers who showed up for the after-school tutoring and acted like they didn't care and came back every week, Lily directing 4-year-olds through their crayon suns. Then we do something, he said. She looked at him. We. Yeah, we. He said it like it was obvious. Ethan, I appreciate it. But what do you think we can do? You work construction and deliver groceries. I bake bread for 28 hours a week now and pick up catering when I can get it. She stopped, realized what she'd said, looked at him. He looked back. You knew about the hours, she said quietly. You got quieter, he said. And then you started doing that thing where you bring your own lunch and don't eat it until you think no one's watching. She was silent for a moment. I should have known you'd notice, she said. Not angry. Something more complicated than that. You noticed me on a bus, he said. You don't get to be surprised when someone notices back. She looked away, up the street at the gray October sky pressing down on the city. He watched her, this woman who gave away her last sandwich and showed up every week and had been quietly carrying her own collapsing world the whole time, and he understood in that moment clearly without question that he was not going to let her carry it alone. I don't know what we can do, he said, but I know we can do more than either of us can do by ourselves, and I think we should find out what that is. She looked back at him. She had spent a very long time believing that the size of what she could do was limited to the size of what she could do alone. People had told her in ways that ranged from cruel to merely thoughtless that people like her didn't change things. They endured things. They survived things. But they didn't change them. She had believed that mostly. Mostly. But she was also the woman who broke her last sandwich in half without hesitating. And standing on the front steps of the community center on a gray October morning with Ethan Carter looking at her like she was someone worth fighting beside. She felt that same impulse, the one that didn't calculate and didn't negotiate and didn't ask first whether she could afford it. She felt it clearly. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They went inside, and they got to work. They sat at a folding table in the back room of the community center for 2 hours that first morning. Just the two of them with a legal pad, 2 pens and a pot of bad coffee that someone had made at 6 a.m. and nobody had touched since. Ethan wrote at the top of the page, "What do we actually have? Not what do we need? Not what's missing. What do we have?" It was the way he approached every problem on a job site. Assess what's actually in front of you before you start figuring out what you're short on. His foreman had taught him that in his first year of construction, and it had turned out to be the most useful piece of advice he'd ever gotten about anything. Molly looked at the question for a moment. Then she said, "We have the volunteers, about 30 regulars." He wrote it down. "We have the space, for 90 days anyway." He wrote that down. "We have a story. The center's been here 11 years. The families know it. The neighborhood knows it." "We have something else," Ethan said. She looked at him. "You," he said. "You know everyone who's ever walked through that door. You know their names. You know their kids' names. You know which families got back on their feet and which ones are still in the middle of it." He paused. "That's not nothing, Molly. That's actually the whole thing." She looked at what he'd written. "What do we do with it?" she said. "We make enough noise that someone with resources hears us," he said. "And we do it before 90 days runs out." She nodded slowly. "The director mentioned a fundraiser. She's been trying to figure out if there's any point." "There's a point," Ethan said. "But it can't be a bake sale." Molly raised an eyebrow. "I mean, your baking is probably excellent," he said. "But a bake sale doesn't tell a story. It raises $200 and then it's over. We need something that makes people feel it." He tapped his pen on the legal pad. "What if families came and shared what this place did for them directly, in front of other people?" "You want testimony," she said. "I want truth," he said. "There's a difference. Testimony sounds like church or a courtroom. Truth sounds like a room full of people who actually lived it." She was quiet for a moment. "Some of these families don't want to be that visible. They came here because they needed help. Not everyone wants that known." "Then we don't force it," he said immediately. "Nobody stands up who doesn't want to. But I think more people will want to than you expect. Because being invisible is exhausting." He said it plainly from somewhere direct and personal. "And sometimes you just want someone to see you and say that was real. What you went through was real. And you made it through anyway." Molly looked at him for a long moment. She thought about herself 2 years ago, sitting in a hospital waiting room alone after the health scare, not calling anyone, because she didn't want to be a burden. She thought about all the years of making herself smaller in rooms where people made her feel like she took up too much space. She thought about the promotion she didn't get, the jobs she didn't get, the door that got shut in her face over and over, and how she'd kept knocking anyway because she didn't know what else to do. She thought about a Tuesday night on a bus and a man who looked like he'd been folding himself in half for years. "Okay," she said. "A community event. Real stories. How do we get people there?" "That's where I need your help," he said. "Because I can carry tables and talk to the families who come in on Saturdays. But you know this neighborhood in a way I don't yet. You know who listens. You know who talks to who." She sat back in her chair. She thought about Reverend Thomas at the church on Maple, who preached to 300 people every Sunday and had a voice like a broadcast signal. She thought about Luis Garza, who ran the bodega on the corner and knew every family within 4 blocks by name and credit history. She thought about the elementary school 2 streets over, where half the kids in the after-school tutoring program went during the day. She thought about Mrs. Chen, who ran the neighborhood Facebook group with the focused intensity of someone running a small government and who could get a post seen by 1,000 people in this zip code within an hour. "I know who to call," she said. "Good," he said. "Then let's call them." They set a date for 3 weeks out. Saturday afternoon, the community center opened to the neighborhood. Hot food space for families, an open microphone for anyone who wanted to speak. Ethan volunteered to handle setup and logistics. Molly volunteered to handle outreach, and when the director looked at both of them, with the exhausted gratitude of a woman who had been holding this building together on her own for too long, Molly and Ethan volunteered to run it. "You don't have to do this," the director, a 60-year-old woman named Ruth Caraway, told them. She looked like she hadn't slept properly in a week, which she probably hadn't. "This isn't your responsibility." "No," Molly agreed. "It's not." She didn't say anything else. But she held Ruth's gaze long enough that Ruth understood. Ruth pressed both hands flat on the table. "All right," she said. "All right. What do you need from me?" The next 2 weeks hit like a freight train. Molly called Reverend Thomas on a Monday morning, and he said yes before she finished explaining. She went to see Luis at the bodega, and he put a handmade sign in his window and told her he'd spread the word to every family he knew, which was most of them. She left flyers at the elementary school, and the library, and the laundromat, and the nail salon, and every other place where people in the neighborhood stopped and waited and had a few minutes to read something. She created an event page. She had never done this before. She figured it out by watching a YouTube tutorial twice, and then just doing it and fixing the mistakes. Within 48 hours, 300 people had clicked that they were interested. She didn't let herself get excited about that number. She'd organized enough things to know that interested was different from there. Meanwhile, Ethan went to work on what he privately thought of as the hard part, the people. The families who had come through the center in the last few years. The ones who had received help during the hardest seasons of their lives. He started carefully. He wasn't going to pressure anyone, wasn't going to make anyone feel obligated, but he started reaching out one conversation at a time and asking a single question. "Do you want people to know your story?" Some said no. He thanked them and moved on. Some said yes immediately without hesitation, with the kind of force that told him they'd been waiting to say it out loud to someone. Some said they'd think about it and called him back 2 days later, having thought about it, having talked to their spouses or their kids, and said yes. By the end of the second week, he had 11 families who were willing to share. 11 families who represented between them job loss, domestic violence, survival, illness, eviction, addiction, recovery, single parenthood grief. 11 families who had walked through the doors of the community center when they had nowhere else to go and had walked out, not fixed, not saved, but steadied. Given enough to keep going. He told Molly the number on a Thursday afternoon, and she stopped what she was doing and stared at him. 11, she said. 11, he confirmed. She picked up her coffee cup and then put it down. Ethan, do you understand how significant that is? I know it's a good number. These are people who had every reason to stay quiet, she said. People who have been told directly and indirectly for years that what happened to them is private and embarrassing and not something you put in front of a room. Her voice was picking up pace. And 11 of them said yes. She looked at him. You did that. We're doing it together, he said. You called them, she said. You're the one who actually asked. He shifted slightly. The thing about Molly he was learning was that she made it genuinely difficult to deflect credit because she came at you from a direction you weren't expecting. Not flattery, just precise accuracy, delivered without warning. I just asked the question, he said. That is the whole thing, she said. Asking the question. They kept going. On Friday night, 8 days before the event, Ethan got a call from his landlord. The rent was late. Not dramatically late 4 days, but his landlord, a man named Gerald Pitts, who owned 6 properties in the neighborhood and managed them with the warmth and flexibility of a parking meter, called at 8:45 in the evening to inform Ethan that he expected payment by Monday, or he would begin eviction proceedings. Ethan listened to this with the phone pressed against his ear and his eyes on the kitchen ceiling. I'll have it to you by Monday, Gerald, he said. I need it by Monday morning, Gerald said. Not afternoon. Monday morning, Ethan said. He hung up. He sat down. He did the math. The rent was $920. He had $711 in his account, which had to cover groceries and Lily's field trip permission slip and the electric bill that was coming Thursday. He had one more paycheck before Monday, but it wouldn't clear until Tuesday. He had never asked anyone for money. Not once. Not in 3 years. Not Karen in Ohio with the 2 incomes and the yard and the dog named Biscuit. Not anyone. He stared at the phone for a long time. Then he thought about Molly, who had called her cousin Diane and hated herself for it, and done it anyway, because some things mattered more than the story you told yourself about needing no one. He called Karen. She picked up on the second ring, and when he said her name and then stopped, there was a pause on the other end, and then Karen said very quietly, Ethan? Tell me what you need." He told her. She didn't pause. She didn't give a lecture. She said, "I'm sending it right now. Don't worry about paying it back until you're ready." And then she said, "I've been waiting for you to call me for 3 years. I'm glad you finally did." He didn't have anything to say to that. "How's Lily?" Karen asked. He found his voice. "She's incredible," he said. "She's Karen you wouldn't believe who she's becoming." "She's your kid," Karen said. "I believe it completely." He paid the rent. And then he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and thought about what it had cost him to make that call, and what it had cost him more to not make it for 3 years, and which cost had been the higher one. And he thought about Molly saying, "Your pride isn't hungry, but you are." And he thought about 11 families who had agreed to stand in a room and say out loud, "I needed help, and I got it, and here is what it meant. I thought I have been so afraid of being one of the people who need something. I forgot that being one of the people who needs something is just being a person." He went to bed. He slept 6 hours, which was more than usual. The following week accelerated in a way that made every day feel like it was running slightly faster than the one before. Molly was everywhere, making calls, confirming speakers, coordinating with the caterer who'd agreed to donate food when she explained what it was, for working with Reverend Thomas on the program order, checking in with Ruth on the logistics, and finding workarounds for everything that wasn't quite working. She ran on 4 to 6 hours of sleep and more coffee than was probably advisable, and the particular kind of energy that comes from doing something that feels genuinely important. Ethan was at every job he was supposed to be at, and every session at the community center he could manage, and somehow also present for Lily's school concert on Wednesday, front row, with a handmade sign that said, "Lily Carter, world's greatest second-grade singer," that made her roll her eyes in front of her classmates and then beam for the rest of the evening. 3 days before the event, something happened that neither of them expected. A local news blog, not a major outlet, just a neighborhood site called Boston Collective, the kind of place that covered city council meetings and school fundraisers, and occasionally broke something real, ran a small piece about the community center's lease situation. The piece had no photos, no quotes from Molly or Ethan, just the basic facts: 11 years of operation, 90-day notice, planned charity event. By the next morning, the community center's phone had rung 14 times. 3 of the callers were from larger news stations. 2 were from non-profit organizations offering potential resources. 1 was a city councilwoman's office. And 8 were from individuals, private citizens, who had read the piece and wanted to know how to help. Ruth called Molly at 7 in the morning. "I need you to come in," she said. She sounded like someone standing at the edge of something large, not sure yet whether it was a cliff or a doorway. Molly went in. She sat with Ruth, and they went through the calls together. The news stations, Ruth was wary of media. Molly told her they didn't have to say yes to everyone, but at least one local news camera at the event would help carry the story beyond the neighborhood, and the story needed to travel if anything was going to change. Ruth agreed to one station. The nonprofit organizations, one of them, was a foundation that distributed grants to community programs. Molly flagged it immediately, wrote down every piece of contact information, and told Ruth she'd follow up. The city councilwoman's office, this one made Ruth narrow her eyes. "Politicians show up when there's a camera," Ruth said. "Exactly," Molly said. Ruth looked at her. "Let her show up," Molly said. "The camera's going to be there. The families are going to be there. Let her stand in a room with 11 families whose lives this place changed and explain to the camera why the city let the lease lapse." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then a slow smile crossed her face. "You have a ruthless streak in you, Molly Harper," she said. "I prefer strategic," Molly said. Ruth laughed. It was the first time Molly had heard her laugh in weeks. When Ethan arrived an hour later and Molly filled him in, he listened with his arms folded and his jaw working slightly, the way it did when he was processing something. Then he said, "The councilwoman's going to try to get in front of it. Take credit if it goes well." "I know," Molly said. "You're okay with that?" "I don't care who gets credit," she said. "I care whether the center stays open." He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Okay." 2 days before the event, the second large thing happened. One of the 11 families, a woman named Darlene Booth, who had come to the community center 4 years ago with 2 kids and a garbage bag of belongings. After leaving a situation she described only as very bad, and who now had a stable apartment and a job at a medical office, Darlene called Molly on a Thursday evening. "I want to change what I plan to say," she said. Molly felt a small drop in her stomach. "Okay, that's completely fine, Darlene. Whatever you're comfortable with." "No, I mean I want to say more," Darlene said. "Not less. I want to say everything. I've been thinking about it all week, and I keep thinking, who am I protecting by staying quiet? Not me. Not my kids. The only people who benefit from me staying quiet are the ones who think people like me shouldn't be visible." Molly sat down. "Are you sure?" she said. "I've been sure for 4 years," Darlene said. "I just wasn't ready before." "You're ready now." "I'm ready now," Darlene confirmed. "And Molly, I've been talking to the other families this week. A few of them want to say more than they originally planned to. I think," she paused, "I think once you know other people are going to speak, it makes it feel safer. Like you're not the only one stepping into the room." After she hung up, Molly sat with the phone in her lap for a long moment. She thought about what Ethan had said weeks ago. Being invisible is exhausting. Sometimes you just want someone to see you and say, that was real. What you went through was real. And you made it through anyway. She hadn't realized when he said it how many people were waiting for exactly that permission. She called Ethan. "Darlene is saying everything," she said when he picked up. "And some of the others are expanding what they're going to share." There was a pause on his end. "Good," he said. "Yeah," she said. "Are you okay?" he asked. The question surprised her. Not because it was unexpected from him. He'd stopped being unexpected weeks ago, but because of the timing of it, the precision of it, the way he had noticed that she needed to be asked. It's a lot," she said. "Good a lot, but a lot." "I know," he said. "I keep thinking about what happens if it doesn't work," she said. "If we do all of this and the center still closes. If these families stand up in front of a room and make themselves vulnerable and nothing changes." I was quiet for a moment. "Something will change," he said. "Even if it's just that 11 families know someone showed up for them the way this center showed up for them." He paused. "And I think it's going to be more than that. But even if it's not, that still means something." She breathed out slowly. "When did you get so calm about all of this?" she asked. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "I'm not calm, I'm terrified, but I'm doing it anyway." A beat. "There's a woman I know who taught me that was an option." She didn't say anything to that, but she smiled. The morning of the event, Ethan arrived at the community center at 7 a.m. with Lily, who had decided the night before with absolute conviction that she was coming to help and that sleeping in was not a priority. She arrived in her soccer sweatshirt with a notebook and pen because she had decided she was also going to take notes for reasons she did not explain and no one questioned. By 9 a.m., the volunteers were arriving. By 10, the caterer showed up with more food than the center had seen in a single delivery in years, donated by the restaurant, donated by 3 local grocery stores that Molly had called on Wednesday, with nothing but the true story of what was happening and what it meant. By 11, the room was set up, and the speakers were arriving and doing what speakers do before events, which is pace and reconsider everything they plan to say, and drink water and pace some more. Darlene arrived at 11:15 in a red dress. Molly saw her from across the room and felt her throat tighten. Darlene had mentioned in one of their phone calls that she almost never wore red because she'd been told somewhere along the way that big women in bright colors were too much. She had decided this week that too much was exactly what she intended to be. She was stunning. Molly crossed the room and hugged her. "You ready?" Molly said. "I've been ready for 4 years," Darlene said. "Let's go." At noon the doors opened. By 12:30 the room was full. Not almost full. Full. Every chair taken. People standing along the walls. People in the hallway, visible through the open double doors. Ruth stood at the back of the room, and Molly watched her scan the crowd and saw the exact moment she understood what was happening. The slight widening of the eyes, the hand that went to her mouth, quickly removed. The local news crew was in the left corner with a camera and a reporter named Kevin Aldridge who looked younger than he probably was and kept checking his notes. The city councilwoman Diane Walsh was in the fourth row, flanked by a staffer, looking like a person who had not anticipated quite this many people and was recalibrating accordingly. Ethan was at the door, managing the flow of people coming in. He was also, Molly noticed, keeping a specific eye on Lily, who had claimed a seat in the second row and was writing in her notebook with the focused intensity of someone filing a report. Reverend Thomas opened the program. He had a voice that did something to the air. In a room, it didn't fill it so much as organize it, give it shape, make everyone in the room feel that what was happening was worth paying attention to. He talked about community, the way people talk about things they genuinely believe in, not the way people talk about concepts they've been handed. And when he was done, the room was already different from when he started. Then the family spoke. The first was a man named Terrence, who had come to the center 3 years ago after losing his job and nearly losing his apartment, and who now managed the stockroom at a distribution center, and whose 12-year-old son was in the back of the room wearing a tie for the occasion. Terrence was not a public speaker. He had never done anything like this before. He held the microphone too close at first, and then too far, and never quite found the right distance, and none of that mattered at all, because what he said about the Wednesday hot meal that kept him going during the weeks when he wasn't sure he was going to make it about Ruth, knowing his name from the very first visit, about the job placement program that found him. The interview that changed everything. Landed in that room like something solid and true. When he was done, the applause was not polite, it was real. The next speaker was a woman named Grace, who had used the center's childcare resources while she finished her GED. After her came a couple, Marcus and Joan, who had received emergency support after a medical crisis had wiped out their savings. After them came a 22-year-old named Devin, who had been in the after-school tutoring program as a teenager and was now in his second year of community college, and attributed without exaggeration and with complete sincerity his academic life to a volunteer tutor he'd met here at 14. The room was not quiet in the passive way of audiences watching something happen. It was the specific charged quiet of people who are listening so hard they've forgotten to be self-conscious about listening. Ethan had moved from the door to the edge of the room. He stood with his arms folded, watching, and he was not. He told himself firmly, going to lose it in a room full of 200 people. Then Darlene stood up. She walked to the microphone in her red dress, with the particular walk of a woman who has decided she is done apologizing for the space she takes up. She adjusted the microphone. She looked out at the room. She found Molly, who was standing to the left, and held her gaze for a moment. Molly nodded. Darlene talked for 8 minutes. She talked about the night she left. She talked about the garbage bag of belongings, and the 2 kids who didn't understand what was happening, but could feel that their mother was scared. She talked about finding the community center's address on a pamphlet in a hospital waiting room, and showing up with nothing, and being treated from the very first moment like a person who deserved to be there. She talked about Ruth, who had sat with her for 2 hours on that first day, and helped her make a list of every resource available to her. She talked about the food pantry that kept her kids fed while she got back on her feet. She talked about the job placement program that found her the medical office position that she had now held for 2.5 years. And then she paused. She looked at the camera in the corner. She looked at the city councilwoman in the 4th row, and she said clearly and steadily, "This building saved my life. This community saved my life. And if the city lets someone develop it into something else, they are choosing a building over the people who live here. I want to make sure that choice is made in public with all of us watching." The room was absolutely silent for approximately 1 second, and then it was not silent at all. Molly looked at Ethan across the room. He was looking back at her. He was not crying. He was extremely close to crying. She gave him a look that said, "Pull it together." He gave her a look that said, "I'm trying." She almost laughed. When the applause settled and Darlene sat down, something in the room had shifted fundamentally. The event had been good before that moment. After it, it was something else. After it, the 200 people in that room were not an audience. They were something more unified than that. Councilwoman Walsh came up after the family speakers were done. She spoke carefully, which was how politicians spoke when they were in a room where carelessness would cost them. She said the city was committed to reviewing the lease decision. She said there were avenues that hadn't been fully explored. She said she personally would be advocating within City Hall for a resolution that kept the center operational. Were these promises? Ethan thought, listening with his arms still folded. Not quite. Were they public commitments that could be pointed to later? Absolutely. He caught Molly's eye again. She had heard exactly what he heard. Then Ruth stood up. Ruth, who had been holding this place together for 11 years on grants and donations, and her own sheer refusal to let it fall. Ruth, who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Ruth, who had looked at two strangers who showed up to help fold tables on a gray Saturday morning, and somehow understood that they were the right people at the right moment. She didn't have prepared remarks. She stood at the microphone and looked at the room and said, "I want to say something about two people who are in this room right now because this event doesn't happen without them." Molly went absolutely still. "A few weeks ago," Ruth said, "a woman who volunteers here every Saturday found out this building was losing its lease. And instead of accepting it, she sat down with a man she'd known for about 5 minutes in the context of folding tables, and they said, 'Okay, we do something.' And they did." She paused. "I've been running this center for 11 years. I have never been more grateful for two people arriving at exactly the right time." She found Molly first. Then she found Ethan. Both of them were looking at the floor. "Look up," Ruth said into the microphone gently. "Both of you. Let people see you." Ethan looked up. Molly looked up. The room found them. And what happened next? The applause that started and didn't stop for a long time, the hands reaching across chairs to squeeze other hands. Lily jumping up from the second row and screaming, "That's my dad," with absolutely no restraint that happened in public, visible the way Darlene had said things needed to happen. In public with all of us watching. Afterward, when the room had thinned and the volunteers were cleaning up and the caterer was packing the last of the food, Kevin Aldridge from the news crew came and found Molly with his camera operator trailing behind. "Ms. Harper," he said, "can I ask you a few questions on camera?" She looked at Ethan, who was nearby stacking chairs. He shrugged, "Meaning it's up to you." She looked at the camera. She had spent years making herself smaller, so other people were more comfortable. She had spent years being overlooked in rooms where she was the most qualified, the most prepared, the most committed. She had spent years believing that people like her didn't get to be the person the camera pointed at. "Sure," she said. Kevin asked her how the event came together. She told the truth: 2 people, a legal pad, a pot of bad coffee. He asked what she wanted people to understand about the center. She told that truth too, that the families who walked through those doors were not charity cases. They were people having a hard season, who needed a hand up, not a handout, and the difference mattered enormously. Then Kevin asked, "What made you decide to get involved in this? You're not on staff here. You had no formal obligation." Molly paused. She thought about a rainy Tuesday, a crowded bus, a man she'd never met who was sitting in exactly the posture of someone who had been alone in something for too long. "A few months ago," she said, "I was on a bus going home from a long shift, and I noticed someone having a hard night, and I had something that could help, so I shared it." She glanced at Ethan briefly. He had stopped stacking chairs. "And it turned out that what seemed like a small thing mattered more than I knew. And I think that's true of everything in this neighborhood. The small things matter more than anyone knows. The hot meal on Wednesday. The person who knows your name when you walk in. The room that's there when you have nowhere else to go." She paused. "All of it is the small thing that turns out to be everything." Kevin held the microphone steady. "And what happens now?" he said. Molly straightened. "Now," she said, "we keep going." The piece ran on the 6 o'clock news. By 9 o'clock, the community center's donation page, which Molly had quietly set up the previous week, and quietly mentioned in all the printed materials had received 47 donations totaling more than $8,000. Ethan saw the number on Molly's phone screen at 9:14, standing in the parking lot of the community center, while Lily slept against his shoulder, out cold, still in her soccer sweatshirt, her notebook clutched in one hand. He read the number twice. "Is that?" he started. "Yeah," Molly said. He exhaled very slowly through his nose. "Molly. I know. That's not enough to save the lease on its own. I know. But it means people are watching. It means the story is moving." "I know," she said quietly, and looked at the number on her screen with an expression he had never seen on her before. Not quite disbelief. Something more complicated. Something that looked like a woman who had spent a very long time being told she couldn't change things, standing at the first moment of evidence that she could. He put his free hand, the one not holding his sleeping daughter, on her arm. She looked up at him. She had given half a sandwich to a stranger on a rainy Tuesday night, thinking it would last approximately as long as it took him to eat it. She had no idea. Neither of them had any idea. But they were starting to. $8,000 was not enough to save the lease. They both knew that the moment the number stopped feeling miraculous and started feeling like math, which happened sometime around 10 o'clock that same night, when Ethan laid Lily down in her bed, still half asleep, and came back to the kitchen and sat down with a pen and paper, the way he always did when reality needed to be faced directly. The lease transfer was a city decision. The developer had already submitted plans. The community center needed not just money, but a reversal of a bureaucratic process that had been set in motion months before either of them had known it existed. $8,000 in donations was extraordinary. It was also, in the context of Boston real estate and city politics, approximately the equivalent of bringing a sandwich to a gunfight. He called Molly at 10:30. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she was still awake and had been waiting. "I've been thinking about the councilwoman," he said without preamble. "Me too," Molly said. "She made public statements tonight, on camera." "She did." "Politicians don't walk back public statements made on camera in front of 200 constituents without a very good reason," he said. "We need to make sure she doesn't find a good reason." Molly was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about keeping the pressure on." "I'm talking about not letting this be a one-night story," he said. "The news piece runs tonight. Tomorrow, it's old news unless something new happens. We need something new to happen." "What are you thinking?" He had been thinking about this since the parking lot. Since watching the donation number climb on Molly's phone screen. Since watching Darlene stand up in a red dress and say things that needed to be said in public. "The foundation that called Ruth," he said. "The grant organization. What do we know about them?" "I followed up Thursday," Molly said. "They're called the Harper Community Foundation. They fund operational costs for nonprofits in the greater Boston area. Ruth's never applied because the application process is intense, and she's never had the capacity to do it while running everything else. Can we do it for her?" A pause. "Ethan, a foundation grant application is—" "I know what it is," he said. "I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying, can we do it?" Another pause. Longer. "I'd need to learn the format," Molly said slowly. "I'd need Ruth to give us the financial documentation and the program data. I'd need—" She stopped. "I'd need about a week of evenings and probably both weekend days." "I have the same," he said. She exhaled. "Let me call the foundation Monday morning and find out the actual timeline." "Okay," he said. "And Ethan." Her voice shifted slightly. "The news piece. Kevin said it would air at 6. Did you watch it?" "I hadn't." He'd been in the parking lot and then putting Lily to bed. "Not yet." "Watch it," she said. "Tonight, before you sleep." "Is there something wrong with it?" "No," she said. "There's something right with it. I just—" She stopped again. "Watch it and then call me." He found the piece on the station's website at 11 p.m. It ran 4 minutes and 20 seconds, which for a local news segment was significant. Kevin Aldridge had done something Ethan hadn't expected. He'd built the piece not around the lease dispute or the city politics, but around the stories. Terrence and his son in the tie. Grace with her GED. Darlene in her red dress saying things that needed to be said in public. The piece had Darlene's full statement almost uncut, which told Ethan that Kevin had understood exactly which moment in the room was the real story. And at the end, Kevin used Molly's answer. The one about the bus. The one about the small thing that turns out to be everything. Ethan sat at the kitchen table and watched Molly on his laptop screen saying those words in her steady, clear voice, and he thought about how she'd looked standing next to that camera, not performing, not managing herself, just telling the truth directly into the lens, and he understood what she'd meant when she said, "Watch it." She needed him to see that she had done that. She needed someone who knew what it cost to witness that she had done it. He called her back. "I watched it," he said. "Okay," she said. "You were—" He stopped, tried to find the right word, and gave up. "You told the truth on camera, in front of a lot of people." "Yeah. I know how much that cost you." She was quiet for a long moment. "It cost less than I thought it would," she said finally. "Which is either because I've gotten braver, or because I've just gotten tired of being afraid. I'm not totally sure which." "Does it matter?" "Maybe not," she said. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, the apartment behind her quiet the way apartments get after midnight. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." He went to bed. He did not sleep for a while. He lay in the dark and thought about the last 3 months. About a community center, and a legal pad, and 11 families, and a woman in a red dress, and a city councilwoman making careful statements in front of a camera. He thought about how none of it had been his plan. He had been on a bus on a rainy Tuesday night with $43 until payday, and a junk drawer full of folded pieces of paper, and somewhere between that Tuesday and tonight, he had ended up in the middle of something that felt improbably like it might matter. I thought about Sarah. I thought about her less often now than he used to. Not because she mattered less, but because the grief had changed shape over 3 years, had shifted from something that ambushed him daily into something that lived more quietly inside him. A permanent something that felt more like gratitude than anguish. Gratitude that she had existed. Gratitude for Lily, who was her continuation in the world. Gratitude strange and real, that she had made him the kind of father he was, someone who had learned through necessity that you couldn't hold everything alone. He fell asleep with that thought still in his chest. The next morning, Lily woke him up at 7:15 by sitting on the edge of his bed and reading from her notebook. "I have notes," she announced. He opened one eye. "From last night." "From last night," she confirmed. "I took notes on all the speakers." He sat up. "Okay." She opened the notebook with the seriousness of someone delivering a briefing. "Terrence was the best speaker except for Darlene," she said. "Darlene was the best. She wasn't scared at all. Or if she was, she didn't show it, which counts the same." She looked at him over the top of the notebook. "Molly should have had a microphone too. She did the most work." He rubbed his eyes. "She did." "Is she going to be okay?" Lily said. He looked at his daughter. "What do you mean?" "I mean—" Lily put the notebook down on her knee and chose her words with the careful precision she used when she was saying something she'd been thinking about for a while. "She does a lot for everybody else. And I was watching, and sometimes she was looking at things from far away, like she was carrying something heavy." She looked at him directly. "You used to look like that all the time. You look like it less now." Ethan sat with that for a moment. "You notice a lot," he said. "Mom said you have to pay attention," Lily said matter-of-factly. "She said most people don't, and that's why they miss things." He hadn't heard Lily quote Sarah in a long time. He let the moment sit without rushing it. "Molly's going to be okay," he said. "She's strong." "Strong people still need people," Lily said, and picked her notebook back up like she'd just made a minor logistical point, rather than the most important observation of the morning. He got up and made breakfast. By Monday the story had moved. The news piece had been shared across social media, not virally, not in the way that made national headlines, but steadily and specifically the way a story travels when it's genuinely true rather than constructed for engagement. People in the neighborhood shared it. Then people outside the neighborhood who knew people in the neighborhood. Then two larger Boston news accounts picked it up and shared it to their platforms, and the donation total climbed from $8,000 to just over $22,000 by Sunday night. Ruth called Molly at 8 a.m. Monday, and her voice had in it something Molly hadn't heard since before the lease notice arrived: cautious, fragile, genuine hope. "I've been getting calls all morning," Ruth said, "from community members, from other nonprofits, from a city planner who is apparently not affiliated with Councilwoman Walsh and who has opinions about the lease decision that differ significantly from the official position." "What kind of opinions?" Molly asked. "The kind that suggest the decision was rushed and that there may be procedural grounds to challenge it," Ruth said. "He's going to connect me with a community development attorney. Pro bono." Molly sat down. She had not expected that. She had hoped for it distantly, the way you hope for things that seem large and unlikely. But she had not expected it on a Monday morning, 8 days after a charity event she and a single father of one had organized with a legal pad and a pot of bad coffee. "Ruth," she said. "I know," Ruth said. "We're also applying for the Harbor Foundation grant," Molly said. "Ethan and I. We're going to put together the application. We need your financial documents and program data." There was a long pause on Ruth's end. "Molly," Ruth said. Her voice was doing something complicated. "I've been meaning to apply for that grant for 3 years. I've never had the capacity," Molly said. "I know. You've been doing everything. Let us do this part." Another pause. "Okay," Ruth said. "Okay," Molly said. She called Ethan immediately after. "Pro bono attorney," she said when he picked up. "Possible procedural challenge to the lease decision, and Ruth's on board with the grant application." She could hear him stop moving on the other end. He was at the job site. She could hear the background noise of a construction crew. "Are you serious?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Dead serious," she said. He exhaled long and slow. Okay. She could hear him recalibrating. "I can't do anything until 6 tonight. Can we?" "My apartment 7 o'clock, she said. "I'll get the documents from Ruth this afternoon." "I'll bring food," he said. She started to say, "Don't worry about it," but stopped herself. She was learning slowly and with effort to let people bring things. "Okay," she said instead. He hung up. She sat for a moment in the quiet of her kitchen, with both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, and thought, this is actually happening. Then she got up and got to work. The grant application process turned out to be exactly as intense as Molly had warned, and exactly as manageable as Ethan had intuited when he said, "Can we do it?" It took 9 evenings spread over 2 weeks, usually starting at 7 and ending somewhere between 10:30 and midnight. They sat at Molly's kitchen table with Ruth's documents and the Harbor Foundation's guidelines and 2 laptops, and divided the work by instinct. Molly, who had better intuitive understanding of the center's programs and the community relationships, wrote the narrative sections. Ethan, who had grown up understanding how to make small resources look as solid as possible on paper, handled the financial components and the data sections. They argued twice. The first argument was over language. Ethan thought a particular section sounded too formal, like a document that had been written for a foundation rather than for the truth. Molly thought his version sounded too casual, like they hadn't done the research. They went back and forth for 20 minutes and then landed on something that was neither of their original versions and was significantly better than both. The second argument was more serious. It happened on the 8th evening when they were working on the section about organizational sustainability. Essentially, what guaranteed the center would still be operating and worth funding in 3 to 5 years. It was the hardest section because the honest answer was nothing guaranteed it. The center's existence had always been dependent on grants and donations and the sheer will of Ruth Carraway, and that was not the kind of answer you put in a grant application. "We have to be honest about the challenges," Molly said. "We also have to make a case for viability," Ethan said. "We can do both. Not if being honest about the challenges makes them think we're not viable." She looked at him. "Are you saying we should—" "I'm not saying we should lie," he said immediately. "I'm saying there's a difference between listing every vulnerability in the organization and making the strongest honest case we can." He paused. "We know the center's challenges. We also know what we've built in the last 3 weeks. The community support, the media attention, the attorney, the donation increase. We frame the sustainability around that, around what's actually changed. She sat with that. I was right. She knew he was right. But she also had spent a lifetime being skeptical of people who dressed up difficult truths in optimistic framing, because she had usually been on the receiving end of those dressed-up truths when they collapsed. If we promise sustainability and then it falls apart, she started. We're not promising anything, we're not building, he said. We are actually building this. The people who came Saturday, the families who spoke. That didn't evaporate after the event. That's real infrastructure. He leaned forward slightly. Molly, what happened Saturday, what you built that doesn't go away, that's not a one-time thing. That's the beginning of what the center could be permanently. She looked at him across the table. She thought about Darlene in the red dress. She thought about 11 families who had said yes. She thought about $22,000 from people who watched a 4-minute news segment and reached into their wallets. Okay, she said. We write it that way. But we write it accurately. Every claim has to be backed up. Every claim will be, he said. They wrote it that way. And on a Wednesday night at 11:48 p.m., Molly hit submit on the Harbor Community Foundation application for a 2-year operational grant of $75,000 per year. She sat back in her chair. Ethan was closing his laptop across from her. He looked up. Done, he said. Done, she said. He exhaled, leaned back, looked at the ceiling. Okay. We should hear within 6 weeks, she said. That's their standard timeline. 6 weeks. Could be sooner. Could be a little longer. He nodded, looked back down at her. Are you okay? She thought about the question. I'm tired, she said. And I'm scared of what happens if they say no. And I think we did the best job we possibly could have done. She paused. So yeah, I'm okay. He nodded. Same. He packed up his laptop. He gathered the documents. He put on his jacket. And then at the door he paused. Can I tell you something? He said. She looked up from the table. Sure. That thing you said to me on the bus, about pride not being hungry. He paused. I've been thinking about that since the night you said it. Not just as advice, as I don't know, as the thing that started all of this. He met her eyes. I don't think I'm the same person I was on that bus. She looked at him for a long moment. Neither am I, she said. He smiled. A real one, the full version that she'd seen rarely enough that she noticed every time. Good night, Molly. Good night, Ethan, she said. The door closed. She sat in the quiet of her apartment and listened to his footsteps on the stairs fading until the building was silent. Then she did what she sometimes did, in moments that felt too large to simply move through. She wrote about it. Not for anyone else. Just to record it somewhere. Just to say to herself, this happened, and it was real, and you were part of it. She wrote for about 20 minutes, and then she closed the notebook and went to bed. Across the city, 3 things were in motion that neither Ethan nor Molly knew about yet. The first was the attorney, a woman named Patricia Solano, who specialized in community development law and had spent 15 years fighting exactly the kind of municipal lease decisions that had been made in the case of the center. Patricia had reviewed the lease transfer documentation over the weekend and found what the sympathetic city planner had suspected a procedural gap. The notification timeline to the existing tenant had not met the requirements of the city's own nonprofit protection ordinance. It was not a guaranteed reversal, but it was a crack in the wall. The second thing in motion was the news piece, which had traveled further than any of them knew. A journalist at the Boston Globe, not a local blogger. The Globe had seen Kevin Aldridge's segment, had done some additional research, and was working on a longer feature piece about the center and the community response. The journalist had left a message for Ruth on Friday that Ruth had not yet had the chance to return. The third thing was something smaller and more immediate, and it landed in Molly's email at 7 a.m. Thursday morning while she was still in the first hour of being awake. The subject line was, Your Story. She almost didn't open it. She got a lot of emails she almost didn't open. But something about the simplicity of the subject line made her click. The email was from a man named Robert Calloway. He was a semi-retired businessman, he said, who had grown up in the neighborhood, the actual neighborhood, 3 blocks from the community center, before leaving for college 40 years ago and building a career in commercial real estate. He had watched the news segment because his younger sister, who still lived in the area, had texted him the link. He had watched it twice. He had looked up the center's donation page. He had read everything he could find about what was happening. I was writing, he said, because he wanted to talk. Not to donate to the page. He wanted to talk. He left a phone number. Molly read the email 3 times. Then she called Ethan. He picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone not yet fully awake. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said. "But I need you to look at something before I do anything with it." She forwarded the email. She waited. She heard him read it on the other end, not literally, but she knew the sound of his silence when he was processing something, had learned it over 3 months of sitting across tables from him. "Robert Calloway," he said slowly. "Yeah." "Commercial real estate background." "Yeah." "Grew up in the neighborhood." "Yeah." He was quiet for another moment. "This could be nothing," he said. "It could be," she agreed. "Or it could be, yeah," she said. Another pause. "Call him," Ethan said. "You think, Molly." His voice was fully awake now. A man with a commercial real estate background who grew up in this neighborhood reaches out directly after watching a piece about a community center losing its lease to a developer. "You call him." She breathed out. "Okay," she said. "Call me after," he said. She called Robert Calloway at 8:15 a.m. He answered on the 2nd ring. His voice was the voice of a man in his mid-60s, measured, specific, not unfriendly. He said he was glad she called. He said he'd been thinking since he watched the segment. He asked if he could ask her a few questions about the situation. She said yes. He asked about the lease dispute, the specifics, the timeline, the legal challenge. She told him what she knew. He asked about the developer's plans for the building. She told him what was public. He asked about the center's programs and the community support and the grant application, and she answered everything directly and without embellishment, because she had learned in 24 years of working in kitchens and bakeries that the people worth dealing with were the ones who wanted the unembellished truth. Then he asked, "What would it take to keep the building as a community space?" She said, "An entity with the resources and credibility to purchase or long-term lease the building would need to make the developer an offer that removes their financial incentive to proceed." There was a brief silence. "That's a sophisticated answer," he said. "I've been doing a lot of research," she said. "I can tell." Another brief silence. "Ms. Harper, I have a non-profit foundation. It's small, fairly quiet. I don't publicize it much. It focuses on community development in neighborhoods where I have personal history. I've been looking for the right project for about 2 years." Molly's hand tightened on her phone. She kept her voice steady. "I see. I'm not promising anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I need to do due diligence. I need to speak with the center's director and your legal team and the city's housing development office. This is not a decision I make on the basis of a phone call." "Of course," she said. "But I want to meet," he said. "In person. Can you make that happen?" "Yes," she said. "When this week?" he said. "If possible." She pulled up her calendar with hands that were not entirely steady. "Thursday afternoon," she said. 2 o'clock, at the center." "I'll be there," he said. She hung up. She sat in her kitchen. She picked up her phone to call Ethan and then put it down. Picked it up again. Put it down. She pressed both palms flat on the kitchen table and breathed. She thought about a Tuesday night on a bus. She thought about a sandwich broken in half. She thought about 5 words she'd said without thinking, "I can survive without it." She thought about how that one moment, that single impulsive, unbudgeted, uncalculated decision to look at a stranger and say, "You matter enough to share with," had led in a chain she never could have predicted to this kitchen, this phone call, this Thursday at 2 o'clock. She picked up her phone. She called Ethan. He answered before the first ring finished. "Well," he said. "He's coming Thursday," she said. 2 o'clock. "He has a foundation. He's been looking for a project. He said, Ethan, he said he's not promising anything, but he said he wants to meet in person, and he said this week." The silence on Ethan's end was the specific silence of a man trying to determine how much hope is appropriate. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. "We get Ruth, we get Patricia, we prepare. We go in Thursday with everything we have." He paused. "And we let it be what it is." "What if it's nothing?" she said. "Then we still have the grant application and the legal challenge and $22,000 in the donation fund and a neighborhood that showed up Saturday," he said. She exhaled. "And what if it's something?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then it's something," he said. "And we figure out what to do with that." Thursday came with a cold clarity that felt to Molly like the weather knew something was happening. She arrived at the community center at 1 o'clock with Ruth and Patricia Solano, the attorney who turned out to be a small, brisk woman in her 40s, who communicated primarily through precise statements and the absence of unnecessary ones. Ethan arrived at 1:15 directly from the job site, still in his work jacket. He'd told his foreman he needed to leave early, and his foreman had said fine, without asking why, which Ethan would remember later as one of the small pieces of grace in a week full of them. Robert Calloway arrived at 1:58. He was a tall man in his mid-60s, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending decades in rooms where things were decided. He shook everyone's hands. He sat down. He looked around the room, not at the walls or the ceiling, but at the people in it. And Molly watched him do this, and understood that he was the kind of man who assessed situations by looking at who was in them. Whatever he saw, it seemed to answer something. He set his briefcase on the table. He said, "I want to hear the full story, not the summary. Everything." Ruth told it. She was precise and thorough, and she did not minimize the challenges which Molly recognized as the correct instinct with this particular person. Patricia outlined the legal situation. Ethan, when Robert directed a question at him about the event and how it had come together, answered in the plain, direct way he always answered things, which was to say exactly what had happened without editorializing. Robert listened to all of it. He asked questions that were specific and technical, and occasionally surprising in their depth, questions about the center's operating costs, the lease terms, the developer's timeline, the zoning classification of the building. Then he turned to Molly. He looked at her for a moment. "The news piece," he said. "You talked about a bus, a sandwich." She met his eyes. "Yes." "Tell me that story," he said. She told it. She told it the same way she told the truth about anything, directly, without decoration, exactly as it had happened. A rainy Tuesday. A crowded bus. A man she'd never met. A sandwich she'd been planning to eat for dinner. 5 words she'd said without thinking. When she was done, Robert Calloway was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My mother used to bring food to our neighbors when she had almost nothing." He said it simply, not like a speech, just like a fact he was placing on the table alongside everything else. She said the same thing every time. She said the neighborhood takes care of itself, or it doesn't. And if we don't take care of it, nobody else is going to come do it for us. The room was very quiet. "She would have liked you," he said to Molly. Molly didn't say anything. She didn't trust her voice entirely in that moment. Robert opened his briefcase. He set a document on the table. "I'm not a man who makes decisions slowly when I know what the right one is," he said. "I've done enough due diligence in the last 4 days to know what I'm looking at." He looked at Ruth. "I want to propose a 5-year lease agreement between my foundation and this community center at a below-market rate that covers the building's operating costs. In parallel, I'll engage with the current developer directly. I know the firm actually from prior dealings to negotiate a transfer that removes them from the project." Ruth put her hand over her mouth. Patricia Solano leaned forward and looked at the document. Ethan was very still. Molly looked at the document on the table. "This is contingent on due diligence being completed in full. Robert continued. And on city approval of the arrangement which, he glanced at Patricia, I understand may require navigating the procedural challenge. It would help our case significantly, Patricia said, already reading to have a viable alternative arrangement on the table. I assumed as much, Robert said. Ruth lowered her hand from her mouth. Her eyes were bright. Mr. Calloway, she said. Her voice was careful, like someone carrying something fragile. Why, I mean, you drove here from— I grew up here, he said simply. I left. I built something. And for a long time I told myself the best thing I could do was succeed somewhere else. He paused. I watched a 4-minute news segment about a woman who gave her last meal to a stranger, and I thought, that's the neighborhood I grew up in. That's who we were. That's who we still are. He looked at Molly directly. I don't want that to be developed into condominiums. The room held that sentence for a moment. Lily was not in the room, but Ethan heard her voice in his head anyway from Saturday morning with her notebook open on her knee. Strong people still need people. He thought yes. And sometimes they show up when you need them from 40 years away, because someone on a rainy Tuesday night decided that a stranger was worth half of everything she had. He thought Sarah would have understood exactly this. He thought, I am not the same person I was on that bus. He looked across the table at Molly. She was looking at the document. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were bright in a way he recognized now from weeks of watching her, that specific brightness that meant she was holding something large and not letting it overflow in front of people she didn't know well enough yet. She felt him looking, and she met his eyes. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. But between them, in the space of that look, something passed that didn't need words. An acknowledgement. A recognition. The particular understanding of two people who have carried something heavy together and have just together set it down somewhere solid. Robert Calloway picked up the document and passed copies around the table. Ruth took hers with both hands. And in that room, in a building that had been told it had 90 days left, the next chapter began. The document sat on Ruth's kitchen table for 6 days. Not because anyone was uncertain, but because due diligence meant something real to Robert Calloway, and he had said so plainly, and everyone in that room had respected it. Patricia Solano was working through the procedural challenge with the city. Robert's team was in conversation with the developer. The grant application to the Harbor Foundation was already submitted and waiting. The donation fund had passed $31,000. 6 days of motion that looked from the outside like waiting. Ethan didn't wait well. He never had. He channeled it into work the job site during the day. The delivery app 2 nights a week, showing up at the community center on Saturday to help with setup the way he always did. Routine was the structure that kept him from spinning out, had been since the first terrible weeks after Sarah. You kept the routine. You kept showing up. You let the outcome come when it came. Molly waited differently. She baked. Not at the bakery. She'd picked up a few extra catering shifts, but her hours at the bakery were still reduced, and she was not going to spend energy resenting it. She baked at home. She had always baked when she was processing something large because the physical precision of it, the weights and temperatures and timing, gave her nervous system something to track while her mind worked through whatever it was working through. She made 3 loaves of sourdough, 2 dozen oatmeal cookies, a tray of brownies she brought to the community center on Wednesday, and a lemon pound cake that she left on Ruth's doorstep with a note that said simply, "You've been carrying this longer than any of us. Thank you." Ruth called her after finding the cake and didn't say anything for about 4 seconds, which was its own kind of answer. On the 6th day, Patricia Solano called with news. The city had reviewed the procedural challenge. The notification timeline violation was confirmed. The lease transfer as executed did not comply with the city's nonprofit protection ordinance. This did not automatically reverse the decision, but it created a formal basis for appeal, and more importantly, it created political pressure on Councilwoman Walsh's office to intervene visibly and publicly, which Walsh's office had already signaled it was prepared to do after the community event. And Robert Calloway's team had reached an agreement in principle with the developer. The developer, it turned out, had 2 other projects in the pipeline and had not anticipated the level of public attention the community center situation had generated. Attention was bad for development timelines. Attention meant City Council, scrutiny and zoning delays and articles in the Globe, because the Globe piece had run that Tuesday a full page in the Metro section with Darlene's quote and Molly's quote and a photograph of the community center that managed to look both worn and vital at the same time. The developer was Patricia said, with the specific neutral tone of an attorney who had won something prepared to negotiate an exit from the lease transfer in exchange for Robert's foundation, assuming the long-term lease at a price that made financial sense for everyone involved, except the developer's original profit margin, which was their problem. Patricia delivered all of this in about 4 minutes on the phone precisely and without drama, and then said, "I'd say we're in good shape." Molly was standing in her kitchen. She sat down on the kitchen floor. Just sat down, on the floor, like her legs had made a unilateral decision. "Molly," Patricia said. "I'm here," Molly said. Yes, good shape. Okay. I'll send the full update to everyone by end of day," Patricia said. "We're not through the finish line yet. There are still signatures and city approvals." "I know," Molly said. "But the hardest part is done," Patricia said. And for someone who communicated primarily through precise statements and the absence of unnecessary ones, this landed like a gift. After she hung up, Molly sat on the kitchen floor for another few minutes. She thought about the last 3 months, the legal pad and the bad coffee, the 11 families, Darlene in the red dress, $22,000 from strangers, 9 evenings at the kitchen table writing a grant application, Robert Calloway driving in from 40 years away because he watched a 4-minute news segment about a woman who broke a sandwich in half on a bus. She thought how. And then she thought that's the wrong question. The right question wasn't how. The right question was the one Ethan had written at the top of the legal pad on the first morning. What do we actually have? They had started with people. They had ended with people. The people were the whole thing beginning to end. She called Ethan. He picked up on the second ring. Job site background noise. "Patricia called," Molly said. "A beat." And, "Developer is negotiating out. City procedural challenge confirmed. Robert's foundation is moving forward." The background noise on his end stopped. She realized he had walked somewhere quieter. "Molly," he said. "I know," she said. "Is it?" "It's real," she said. Patricia said the hardest part is done. How was quiet for a moment. She knew that silence now, she'd learned it over 3 months of sitting across tables from him in the late evenings, the specific quality of his quiet, when he was letting something large settle instead of rushing to respond to it. "Okay," he said. His voice was rough in a way it wasn't usually rough. "Okay," she agreed. "I have to finish the day," he said. "I know. Go." "Molly." "Yeah. We did it," he said. Just that. Plain and direct and completely himself. She pressed her lips together for a second. "Yeah," she said. "We did." She heard him take a breath. Then he went back to work. She got up off the kitchen floor. She had catering that evening, a corporate dinner in Back Bay, 3 hours of serving people who would never know her name, and she went and did it, and came home and slept 8 hours for the first time in weeks. The following Saturday, something unexpected happened at the community center. Ethan was there as always, helping set up tables. Lily was there as always, organizing the children's table with 4-year-old authority. Molly arrived at 9 a.m. with a bag of supplies, and the particular kind of calm that comes after something large has shifted, and the body is still adjusting to the new weight distribution. At 10 o'clock, before the doors opened to the public, Ruth gathered everyone, the volunteers, the regular families who helped Ethan, Molly, Lily in the main room. She stood in front of them, and she said, "I want to tell you all what's happening, because you're the ones who made it happen, and you deserve to hear it from me directly." She told them everything. The procedural challenge, the developer negotiating out, Robert Calloway's foundation, the grant application pending, the $31,000 in community donations. The room was very quiet while she spoke. When she finished, no one said anything for a moment. Then Terrence, who had been the first speaker at the event, the man with the 12-year-old in the tie, said from the back of the room, "So we're staying." Ruth looked at him. "We're staying," she said. And the room broke open. Not in a dramatic way. Not like a movie. More like the way a room full of people breaks open when they've been holding their breath for a long time and have just been told they can stop, a kind of collective exhale that expressed itself in noise and motion, and people grabbing each other's arms, and Lily jumping up and down 3 times with her fists in the air before composing herself back into the serious 8-year-old she considered herself to be. Molly was standing near the wall. Ethan found her from across the room. He crossed it without thinking about it past Terrence and the volunteers and Lily, who was now telling another child the exact details of what had just been announced, and he stopped in front of Molly and looked at her. She was holding it together. Barely, but holding it. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. "You okay?" "I will be in about 30 seconds, she said, pressing the back of one hand briefly to her jaw, the way she did when she was keeping herself from becoming something other than composed in public. "Give me 30 seconds. He waited. 23 seconds later, she lowered her hand and looked at him steadily. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. He didn't hug her. He didn't make it a moment. He just stood there with her in the controlled chaos of the room for a few seconds. 2 people who had built something together standing in the middle of it, and that was enough. More than enough. Then Lily appeared at Ethan's elbow. "Dad," she said. "Molly, I have a question." They both looked down at her. She had her notebook. She had the pen. She looked between them with the focused expression of someone who has been thinking carefully about something and has decided the time has come to raise it. "Are you two going to get married?" she asked. The noise level in the room around them did not change. Ethan's face did something complicated. Molly made a sound that was technically a laugh. "Lily," Ethan started. "Mom said you should always ask the direct question," Lily said, completely unbothered. "Because indirect questions waste everyone's time." "Your mother was right about that," Ethan said carefully. "In most contexts." "This seems like a direct context," Lily said. Molly looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Molly. He had been asking himself a version of this question for the last several weeks and answering it by not answering it, by focusing on the grant application and the attorney and the event and the legal pad and the bad coffee and all the other things that kept the question in the category of something to address later. Molly had been doing the same thing. They both knew it. "That's a conversation for later," Ethan told his daughter. Lily wrote something in her notebook. "What are you writing?" Molly asked. "Pending," Lily said, and capped her pen. She walked away. Molly pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling. Ethan looked at the floor. They were both extremely close to laughing, and neither of them let themselves. And both of them knew the other one was not letting themselves, and that itself was nearly enough to finish them off. "She is exactly like her mother," Ethan said finally. "I know," Molly said. "I love that about her." He looked at her when she said that. She felt it, but didn't look back. The doors opened. The day went on. 3 weeks later, the Harbor Community Foundation called. Molly was at the bakery. Her hours had actually been restored 2 weeks prior after the Globe piece ran, and the owner, whose sense of community extended exactly as far as useful publicity, had decided that having Molly Harper at reduced hours was a public relations liability, and she was in the middle of shaping a batch of sourdough when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She looked at the screen. Harbor Community Foundation. She put the dough down. She walked to the back of the kitchen, out through the service door into the narrow alley behind the bakery, and answered the phone with flour still on her hands. A woman named Catherine Park introduced herself as the foundation's program director. She said she was calling to inform Molly, and would also be calling Ruth directly, that the Harbor Community Foundation had reviewed the application for a 2-year operational grant. Molly stood in the alley with flour on her hands and her heart in her throat. Catherine Park said, "We'd like to offer the full grant amount, $150,000 across 2 years at $75,000 per year. We were particularly impressed with the application's narrative sections and the evidence of community engagement." Molly said, "I'm sorry, can you repeat the amount?" Catherine repeated it. Molly put her free hand flat against the brick wall of the building. $150,000. "Ms. Harper," Catherine said, "I'm here," Molly said. Yes, thank you. Can I need to call our director." "Of course. I'm reaching out to her now as well. Congratulations, Ms. Harper. This is exactly the kind of community project we exist to support." Molly hung up. She stood in the alley with flour on her hands and her back against the brick wall, and she did not cry. She breathed. She breathed again. She looked up at the strip of gray sky between the buildings, and she thought, okay. Then she called Ethan. "I was on a job site," and he answered, and she said, "$75,000 a year for 2 years." And there was a long silence, and then he said very quietly, "Molly." And she said, "I know." And that was the whole conversation, because neither of them had anything else to add to it. Ruth got her call from Catherine Park 7 minutes later and called Molly immediately after, and Ruth's voice was the voice of someone who had been holding an organization together on goodwill and determination for 11 years and has just been told the foundation is solid, and it was the sound of a woman setting something down finally after a very long time. The formal signatures for Robert Calloway's foundation lease arrangement were completed on a Tuesday afternoon in Patricia Solano's office. A cold, clear Tuesday. Not raining. Ethan noticed this. It seemed important that it wasn't raining. Everyone was there. Ruth, Patricia, Robert, Molly, Ethan. Lily was at school. Robert's attorney was present. The City Housing Development Office had sent a representative. Councilwoman Walsh had released a statement that morning, calling the resolution a testament to the strength of Boston's communities, which Ethan read once and then put down without comment, and Molly read once and then sent him a text that said, "Strategic." He sent back exactly. The signing took about 20 minutes. When it was done, Robert Calloway looked around the table and said, "My mother would have been glad about this." Nobody felt the need to say anything in response. Some things land better without a response. After on the sidewalk outside Patricia's building, Robert shook Ethan's hand and then Molly's, and he held Molly's hand for a moment longer and said, "What you did with that sandwich, I know you think it was small." "It was small," she said. "No," he said simply. "It was exactly the right size." He got into a car and left. Ethan stood beside Molly on the sidewalk. The street was going about its business the way streets do, indifferent, continuous, unaware that anything significant had just happened inside that building. Cars passed. People walked. A delivery truck double-parked, and someone honked, and nobody cared. "It's really done," Molly said. "The building part," he said. "Yeah." She looked at him sideways. "What other parts are there?" He met her eyes. He had been not answering this question for months. The version Lily had put directly, and the version he'd been having with himself in the kitchen at midnight, and the version he had every time he sat across a table from Molly in the late evening and thought about what it would feel like to not have a table between them. He was done not answering it. "Can I take you to dinner?" he said. "Not a working dinner, not a grant application dinner, an actual dinner where neither of us has a legal pad." She looked at him for a moment. She had also been not answering the question. She had been very deliberate about not answering it because she had spent years in situations where she'd misread something, where she'd thought something was building and discovered it wasn't, and the experience of being wrong about that in a very lonely way had made her careful. But this was Ethan. This was the man who had noticed her hours were cut and brought food to the center without comment. The man who had written, "What do we actually have?" at the top of a legal pad at 7 in the morning on a gray October day. The man who had called his sister in Ohio after 3 years because she had told him that pride wasn't hungry. The man whose daughter had written pending in a notebook 3 weeks ago and not brought it up again because she had her mother's patience along with her mother's directness. She was done not answering it too. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, like he'd been holding that breath longer than he knew. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she agreed. They went to dinner on Friday at a small Italian place in the South End that Ethan had looked up and booked 2 days in advance, which was not a thing he had done in years, and which Lily had provided detailed unsolicited feedback on when he mentioned it, including that he should bring flowers and that the restaurant's online reviews were 4.3 stars, which was good, but he should read the negative ones too, just to be thorough. He did not bring flowers. He did bring himself on time in a jacket that didn't have any job site damage on it, having arranged for Karen, who had driven up from Ohio, specifically claiming she had other plans in Boston, which no one believed, to stay with Lily for the evening. Molly was already there when he arrived. She was wearing a dark green top he hadn't seen before, and her hair was down, and she looked like herself, which sounds like a simple thing, but wasn't, because the particular version of herself she looked like was the one that only came out when she wasn't managing how she was perceived, and he'd seen it increasingly over the last months, and it was every time the best version of anything in whatever room they were in. He sat down. She looked at him. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. "No legal pad," she said. "No legal pad," he confirmed. She smiled. They ate dinner for 3 hours. Not because the food was slow, it wasn't, but because they talked the way people talk when they have been talking practically for months and have just been given permission to talk about everything else. He told her about Sarah, the full version, not the compressed, careful version he usually gave, what she was like, what their life was like before the thing. He thought about regarding the argument he couldn't remember, and how he had gotten to a place with it that wasn't okay exactly, but was livable. Molly listened the way she always listened, which was completely without performing understanding, just actually understanding. She told him about her own history, the years before the bakery, a relationship in her late 20s that had ended badly and had left her with the particular kind of damage that takes a long time to notice because it looks like reasonable caution from the inside. The years of believing that the size of her life was determined by the size of other people's willingness to see her. "And now," he said, she thought about it. "Now I think the size of my life is determined by what I'm willing to give it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "That sounds like something that cost a lot to learn." "Most things worth knowing do," she said. They walked after dinner. Not far, not with any destination, just along the sidewalk in the cold November air. And at some point, without either of them narrating it, they were walking with his hand around hers, and neither of them said anything about it because there was nothing necessary to say. He walked her home, at her building door. She turned and looked at him with the direct, clear gaze that he had come to understand was just who she was. Someone who looked at things straight on, who didn't flinch from what was actually in front of her, who had broken a sandwich in half for a stranger on a rainy Tuesday night, because she had looked at him directly and seen what was there. "Lily wrote pending," Molly said. "She did," he said. "Are we updating her notebook?" He looked at her for a moment. "I'd like to," he said. She smiled. "The full version. Not the one corner, not the controlled version. The real one that he had been cataloging since the first time he saw it on the front steps of the community center, the one that changed the whole shape of her face." "Good night, Ethan," she said. "Good night, Molly," he said. He walked home. He was smiling on the sidewalk by himself in the November cold, and he didn't care who noticed. Karen was awake when he got home, reading on the couch, and she looked at him when he came through the door and said, "Oh, thank God," with the relief of an older sister who has been worried about her younger brother for 3 years. "I'm fine, Karen," he said. "You're better than fine," she said. "That's what I mean." Lily appeared from the hallway in her pajamas, which meant she had not actually been asleep. "How was it?" she said. "Good," he said. "How good, Lily?" "On a scale of 1 to 10, she said. He looked at his daughter. This child who had saved food for him and quoted her mother, and written pending in a notebook, and watched him from across rooms for 3 years to determine whether he was going to be okay. 11, he said. She nodded seriously. "I'll update my notes," she said, and went back to her room. Karen looked at him. He looked at Karen. "Don't," he said. "I'm not saying anything," she said, and went back to her book, and she was smiling. 1 year later, the community center reopened under its new arrangement on a Saturday in November, 1 year and 3 weeks after a rainy Tuesday night on a city bus. The building had not changed. They hadn't done a renovation or a rebrand. The same worn floors, the same folding tables, the same hand-painted signs that various volunteers had made over the years, and that Ruth had never replaced because she felt they were more honest than professional ones. What had changed was the solidity of it, the sense as you walked through the doors that this place was not provisional. that it was not surviving day to day on good intentions and barely enough, that it was finally built to last. The event was smaller than the charity fundraiser. Intentionally. Ruth had wanted something for the people who lived it, not something for cameras. And so it was families and volunteers and neighbors, hot food and folding chairs, and the particular warmth of a room where everyone knows they belong. Darlene was there in a different red dress. She had started volunteering at the center herself, working with Ruth on the domestic violence support resources, and she had the particular presence of someone who has turned their own surviving into something useful to others. Terrence was there with his son, who was now 13, and had recently announced his intention to become an engineer. A plan he had made after helping Ethan fix a stuck table leg with improvised tools on a Saturday morning, and deciding that figuring out how things worked was what he wanted to do with his life. Devin, the 22-year-old who had been in the after-school tutoring program as a teenager, was there in his community college sweatshirt. He had told Ruth the previous week that he was applying to transfer to a 4-year university in the fall. Ruth had said good, and then gone to her office and closed the door for 5 minutes, which everyone understood. Robert Calloway was there. He arrived quietly and stood in the back, and when Ruth tried to put him at the front near the podium, he said with the polite firmness of a man who means what he says that he was fine where he was. He was not there for recognition. He was there because his mother would have wanted to see this room. Karen had driven up from Ohio again this time without pretending she had other plans. Lily was there in a dress she had chosen herself. Dark blue with white buttons, which she had decided was the appropriate choice for an occasion of significance, a determination she had made without consulting anyone. At some point in the afternoon, Ruth called for quiet. She said she wanted to say something, and it would be brief, which was unusual for Ruth, who was thorough, and so the room understood that brevity meant wait. She said, "A year ago, this building had 90 days. And the reason it doesn't have 90 days anymore is the same reason it survived the 11 years before that. Because people in this neighborhood decided it mattered and acted like it mattered. And two of those people." She looked at Molly, who was standing near the food table, and at Ethan, who was next to her, showed up on a gray October morning and said, "Okay, we do something." And they did. The room found them. It was smaller than the applause at the charity event, but it was warmer. Because these were the people who actually knew them, and warmth from people who actually know you lands differently than applause from a crowd. Ethan looked at the floor. Molly looked at Ruth with the clear, steady gaze she had for things she wanted to receive fully. Then Lily, in her dark blue dress, walked across the room and stood next to her father and took his hand. He looked down at her. "Mom would have liked today," she said. Not a question. Just something she knew. He squeezed her hand. "Yeah," he said. "She would have." "She would have liked Molly," Lily said. He looked up. Across the room. Molly was talking to Darlene, laughing at something, her head thrown back completely herself. "Yeah," he said. "She really would have." Lily looked up at him. "You okay, Dad?" she said. He looked at his daughter. At this person who had watched him from across rooms for 3 years and saved food for him and quoted her mother's wisdom and written pending in a notebook and updated her notes, and who was somehow, despite everything, the most complete and whole 8, now 9 years old, he had ever encountered. "Yeah," he said, and he meant it in a way that no longer required work to mean it. "I'm really okay." Later, after the event wound down and the tables were stacked and the last of the food was packed up, and Ruth had hugged everyone twice, and Robert Calloway had shaken hands with quiet dignity, and Karen had taken Lily to get ice cream, giving Ethan and Molly the specific conspicuous privacy of an older sister who has been waiting 3 years to do exactly that. They stood on the front steps of the community center in the November cold. It was not raining. It hadn't been a rainy night in weeks, but Ethan thought about rain anyway. About a Tuesday night and a number 47 bus, and a woman who got on at the Elm Street stop with an inside-out umbrella and a sandwich in a brown paper bag, and somehow saw him when he was working very hard at being invisible. He thought about what it cost her to hand that sandwich across the aisle. He thought about what it would have cost him to never have taken it. I thought about 11 families and a legal pad and bad coffee, and 9 evenings of grant applications, and a room full of 200 people, and a man who grew up 3 blocks from here, driving back from 40 years away, because a 4-minute news segment reminded him of who he came from. He thought about Darlene in her red dress saying in public with all of us watching. He thought about Lily writing pending in her notebook with a capped pen. Molly pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "You're thinking loudly," she said. "Sorry," he said. "Don't apologize for it. I like it." She looked sideways at him. "What are you thinking about?" He looked at the street. At the neighborhood that had shown up and kept showing up and turned out to be exactly what it needed to be when it needed to be it. "That night on the bus," he said. "I keep coming back to it." "Me too," she said. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She looked at him. "I know. But you did it anyway." "I did." He turned to face her. She looked back at him with the steady, clear gaze that had been looking at things straight on since before he'd known her, since a rainy Tuesday when she'd looked across an aisle and seen a man who had been invisible for too long and decided that was not acceptable. "Thank you," he said, "for the sandwich and everything that came after it." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for taking it," because that was the truth. Neither of them had said out loud before that the giving only mattered because he had finally been willing to receive. That the chain of everything that followed required both of them at both ends of it. That strength was not what you carried alone. It was what you built together piece by piece, from the first small act to the last signature on a lease that meant a building full of people could keep going. This is what a sandwich on a rainy night made possible, not by magic, not by luck, but because one woman looked at a stranger and chose to see him, and one man looked back and chose not to look away. And everything real that two people can build together started exactly there in the simplest, most human decision there is. The decision to say you matter enough to share with. Some people wait their whole lives for a grand gesture, a perfect moment, a sign that something is worth starting. But the truth, the real truth, the kind that holds up in November, cold on a sidewalk in front of a building that almost wasn't there, is that the grand gesture was always the small one. It was the sandwich. It was the question asked directly. It was showing up on a gray Saturday morning and saying, "Okay, we do something," and meaning it. It was the woman who had almost nothing giving everything, and not even knowing she was doing it. It was the father who had been invisible for 3 years, finally allowing himself to be seen. And it was the life that grew steadily and without fanfare. In the space that decision opened up, larger than either of them had imagined, more durable than either of them had hoped, and completely entirely built from the truth that the smallest things are never actually small. Because the woman who said "I can survive without it" gave a broken man something worth surviving for. And that changes everything, every single time.